I never imagined that that Sunday morning would completely change everything I thought I knew about my family, about my son, and especially about Sarah, my daughter-in-law, that woman I always considered too weak for my boy. It was one of those quiet October Sundays, with the sun streaming through the windows of my house in Connecticut, illuminating the living room where I had spent the last 25 years of my life alongside my husband Richard, until God took him 3 years ago. The house was too silent, as it always was since he departed, but I had learned to live with that silence, to embrace it as part of my widow's routine. I was in the kitchen preparing my breakfast, that same routine as always, when I heard the doorbell ring. It wasn't common to receive visitors so early on a Sunday, so my heart gave that little jump that always happens when something out of the ordinary interrupts our established routine. I wiped my hands on the flowered apron that Richard gave me on our last anniversary together. That apron I refused to replace even with the stains and tears of time, and walked to the door with slow steps, unhurried, imagining that perhaps it was some neighbor asking to borrow sugar, or perhaps the Jehovah's Witnesses who used to show up from time to time. When I opened the door, however, everything I expected to find simply evaporated from my mind, like mist under the hot midday sun. There on my porch stood my son Thomas and Sarah, my daughter-in-law, and between them, holding little Emily, my granddaughter of only 2 years, was a woman I hadn't seen in exactly 27 years. Margaret. Margaret Thornton, my younger sister, the baby of the family, the one who disappeared from our lives when she was only 19 years old, leaving behind a shattered family and a trail of unanswered questions. My heart literally stopped for a few seconds, and I felt my legs weaken, my vision blur at the edges, and it was when I looked at Sarah that I noticed she was completely pale, with tears streaming down her delicate face. Those green eyes that my son loved so much now filled with a pain I couldn't understand. Why was Sarah crying? What was Margaret doing there after almost 3 decades of total absence, without a letter, without a call, without a single sign of life? And why, for God's sake, was my son holding Margaret's hand as if she were someone precious who needed to be protected? Thomas looked at me with that serious expression he inherited from his father, that look that always told me something important was about to happen. And then he said in a low, controlled voice that scared me more than any scream could have, he said, "Catherine, Mom, we need to talk, and it has to be now. We can't put this off any longer." I couldn't speak. My vocal cords simply refused to function, so I just stepped back and let them in. All of them, including Margaret, who avoided looking directly at me, her eyes fixed on the floor of my living room as if the pattern of my Persian rug was the most fascinating thing in the world. Sarah was still crying, now trying to disguise it by wiping her face with the back of her hands while holding Emily with the other arm. And little Emily, blessed innocence of childhood, looked at all of us with those curious eyes, trying to understand why the adults around her were so strange. I closed the door behind them and felt as if I were closing the door on one life and opening another completely different one, a life where nothing I thought I knew made sense anymore. Everyone sat down in my living room, on those sofas where Richard and I had spent countless nights watching television, reading books, talking about our dreams and plans for the future, and now that familiar space was occupied by people who carried secrets too heavy to be contained any longer. Thomas sat next to Margaret, which seemed strange to me, very strange, because why would my son be showing so much closeness with an aunt he didn't even remember meeting, since he was only 3 years old when she disappeared? Sarah sat alone in an armchair, still holding Emily, and I noticed that she deliberately chose to distance herself from Thomas, putting physical distance between them in a way I had never seen before in the 7 years they had been married. I sat in my favorite chair, that rocking chair that Richard bought for me when Thomas was born, and waited, my heart beating so hard that I was sure everyone in the room could hear it, waiting for someone to break that dense silence that had settled in like a toxic fog. It was Margaret who spoke first, her voice hoarse and trembling, a voice that carried the weight of almost 3 decades of silence and secrets, and she said, "Catherine, I know you have every right to hate me, to throw me out of your house and never want to see me again in your life. But I need you to hear me. I need you to know the truth about why I disappeared that summer night in 1998. I said nothing, just nodded because my voice still refused to function. And then Margaret continued, her hands trembling in her lap, her eyes finally meeting mine with an intensity that made me recoil involuntarily. She said that that night, the night she turned 19, she discovered something about our family, about our father specifically, something so horrible and disturbing that she simply couldn't continue living under the same roof as him. I felt a chill run down my spine because I already knew, deep in my heart, I always knew there was something wrong with Dad, something dark that he hid behind that facade of respectable community man, successful car dealership owner, active church member, exemplary family man in the eyes of everyone who didn't live within the walls of our house. Margaret then told, with a voice that broke every few words, that Dad had abused her since she was 11 years old, that those abuses continued for 8 long years until she finally had enough courage to run away, to disappear in the middle of the night, taking only a backpack with some clothes and all the money she had saved working part-time at a diner. I felt as if the floor had opened beneath me and I was falling into a bottomless abyss. Because how was it possible that this had happened under my nose, in my own house, with my younger sister, and I hadn't noticed anything? How could I have been so blind, so absolutely oblivious to the suffering that was happening just a few meters away from my room? Tears began to stream down my face without my being able to control them, and I looked at Margaret, and all I could say was, I didn't know. Margaret, I swear by everything that is sacred that I didn't know. If I had known, I would have protected you. I would have gotten you out of that house. I would have reported that monster. But I didn't know. How could I not have known? Margaret shook her head and said that she never blamed me, that she knew I was also a victim of Dad in my own way, trapped in a marriage that had been arranged even before I finished high school, living a life that wasn't really my choice, but rather the path that had been laid out for me by a society and a family that didn't give women real options. She said she spent the last 27 years trying to rebuild her life, that she changed cities, changed her name, started from scratch working jobs that barely paid the bills while doing therapy to deal with the trauma, and that she eventually managed to build a reasonably stable life, never married, never had children because she couldn't trust anyone enough for that. But she had friends. She had a career as a nurse in a hospital in Boston. She had a life that was hers and hers alone. And then she said something that made me look at Thomas with an expression of complete confusion. She said that 6 months ago, she was working in the emergency room of the hospital when they brought in a young man who had suffered a serious car accident. And when she looked at that bruised and bloodied face, she saw Richard. She saw my late husband so clearly that her heart almost stopped. And then she realized it wasn't Richard, but someone who must be his son. And that's how she met Thomas. I looked at my son with wide eyes because he had never told me about any car accident 6 months ago. And then Thomas lowered his head, ashamed, and said that he hadn't told me because it had been his fault. He was driving distracted using his cell phone and hit another car. Fortunately, no one was seriously hurt, but he ended up with some fractures and a mild head trauma that required a few days of hospitalization. He said that it was during that hospitalization that Margaret took care of him, that they started talking, and eventually Margaret revealed who she really was, showed old photos of our family that she had kept all those years. And Thomas was shocked to discover he had an aunt that no one had ever mentioned, an aunt who had simply disappeared from the family narrative as if she had never existed. And then, and this is where my heart really started racing in an alarming way, Thomas said that he and Margaret developed a close friendship during those months, that they met regularly to talk, that Margaret became a confidant, someone he could trust with secrets and feelings he couldn't share with anyone else. It was at that moment that Sarah let out a loud sob and squeezed Emily against her chest so hard that the girl started to complain, and Thomas looked at his wife with an expression of such deep guilt that I immediately knew there was more, much more to be revealed. Sarah then spoke for the first time since they entered the house, her voice broken by emotion, saying that 3 months ago she discovered messages between Thomas and Margaret, messages that initially seemed innocent but gradually became more intimate, deeper, sharing things he no longer shared with her, his own wife. Sarah said she confronted Thomas about this, and he promised there was nothing inappropriate, that Margaret was just his aunt, and he was getting to know better a family member who had been lost for so long. But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that there was something wrong, something that went beyond a simple family reunion. And then, 2 weeks ago, Sarah decided to follow Thomas when he said he was going to work late, but instead he went to Margaret's apartment in Boston, and Sarah followed him and saw through the window the two of them sitting together on the sofa, very close, and saw when Thomas placed his hand on Margaret's face in a way that was much more than affectionate. It was something that completely exceeded the boundaries of a relationship between aunt and nephew. I felt as if I had taken a punch to the stomach and couldn't breathe properly, looking at Thomas with a mixture of horror and disbelief, hoping he would deny it, that he would say Sarah had misunderstood, that it was just a misinterpreted moment. But Thomas didn't deny anything. He just lowered his head even more and said in a voice so low it could barely be heard. He said, "Mom, I know this is horrible. I know it's wrong in every possible way, but I fell in love with Margaret, and she fell in love with me, and we didn't want this to happen. We fought against these feelings for months, but they only got stronger, and now we don't know what to do anymore, because we can't simply ignore what we feel, but we also know this is going to destroy everything. It's going to destroy my family. It's going to destroy my marriage. It's going to destroy the image you have of me as your son." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My own son confessing that he was having an emotional and apparently also physical relationship with my sister, with Margaret, a woman who was 24 years older than him, a woman who was his blood aunt, regardless of not having grown up together or known each other for most of their lives. Margaret then intervened and said that she tried to resist, that when she realized she was developing feelings for Thomas, she stopped seeing him for a few weeks, but that Thomas kept looking for her, sending messages, showing up at the hospital where she worked, saying he needed her, that she was the only person who really understood him. And eventually, she gave in because she also couldn't deny what she felt. She said she knew this was taboo, that society would never accept it, that it was wrong on so many different levels, but that when you spend 27 years of your life completely alone, never allowing anyone to really get close, and then suddenly you find someone who makes you feel seen, understood, valued, it's almost impossible to simply push that away. I got up from my rocking chair so abruptly that it almost toppled over, and I started pacing back and forth across the room, my hands shaking, my mind racing in 1,000 different directions, trying to process all of this, trying to understand how we got to this point, how my family had become this tangle of trauma, secrecy, and transgression. Sarah was crying openly now, no longer trying to hide or disguise it, tears falling on little Emily's head as she looked at her mother with childish concern. And then Sarah said that the worst of it all wasn't just the emotional betrayal. It wasn't just the fact that her husband was in love with another woman, but it was the fact that this woman was a family member, was someone who should have a completely different role in their lives, and that now everything was contaminated. Everything was ruined, and she didn't know how to explain to Emily when she grew up why her family was so broken, so dysfunctional. I stopped walking and looked at Sarah with deep compassion because I could see my own reflection in her. I could see the woman I was so many years ago, the woman who discovered that the life she thought she was living was actually built on foundations of sand, ready to crumble at the slightest touch. And then I looked at Margaret, really looked at her for the first time since she entered my house, and I saw not the younger sister who disappeared almost 3 decades ago, but a woman marked by life, by traumas, by difficult choices and impossible circumstances, a woman who carried in her eyes a kind of tiredness that went far beyond the physical. I approached her and sat next to her on the sofa, pushing Thomas away with a hand gesture because I needed a moment alone with my sister. And then I took her hands in mine, those hands that were so similar to our mother's hands, and said, "Margaret, I'm so sorry. I'm sorry for everything you went through. I'm sorry for not realizing what was happening. I'm sorry you carried this weight alone all these years. I'm sorry our family failed you in so many different ways." Margaret started crying then, silent tears that streamed down her face, aged prematurely by suffering. And she said she never blamed anyone but Dad, that she understood I was also a victim in my own way, trapped in an era and culture that didn't give women the tools or power to question or challenge the men in their lives. But then I had to ask the difficult question, the question that had been burning in my throat since this whole confession began. I asked Margaret, "Do you really believe that what you have with Thomas is true love? Or could it be that you're confusing gratitude, lost family connection, and perhaps even an unconscious attempt to recover the years that were stolen from you?" Margaret was silent for a long moment, her eyes lost somewhere distant, and then she admitted she wasn't sure, that perhaps there was some truth in what I was saying, that perhaps she was looking for something in Thomas that had nothing to do with who he really was, but rather with what he represented, a connection to the family she lost, a bridge to a past she had to abandon, a chance to be part of something again after spending almost 3 decades being a lonely island. And then she looked at Thomas and said, with painful honesty, that perhaps they really needed to examine what was happening between them, whether it was really romantic love or if it was something more complicated, something born of unique circumstances and trauma shared in different ways. Thomas was visibly shaken by this, as if the ground had been pulled out from under him, and he looked at Sarah with an expression of growing desperation, and I realized at that moment that my son was beginning to understand the magnitude of what he had done, what he was risking, what he had potentially already lost. Sarah was still crying, but now there was something different in her crying. It wasn't just pain and betrayal, but also a kind of contained rage, a fury of a woman who had been disrespected, diminished, replaced by someone who shouldn't even be in the equation. And then Sarah spoke, her voice now firmer despite the tears, saying that she had spent the last 7 years building a life with Thomas, that she had given up her career in law to take care of Emily when she was born, because Thomas insisted it would be better for the family if one of the parents stayed home, that she had placed his needs and desires always ahead of her own, and that now, discovering that while she was at home taking care of their daughter, he was developing an intimate connection with another woman was simply unbearable. I looked at Emily, that innocent child who had no idea that her world was crumbling around her, and I thought about all the children who grow up in broken families, carrying trauma they didn't choose, paying the price for the decisions and actions of the adults who should protect them. I thought about how the cycle of trauma perpetuates through generations, how what Dad did to Margaret created waves that were still spreading decades later, affecting people who weren't even born when the abuse happened. I thought about how Richard, if he were alive, would be dealing with all this, if he would have enough wisdom to navigate this impossible situation, or if he too would be as lost as I was feeling at that moment. And then I realized there was no easy solution to this. There were no magic words I could say to fix everything. There was no way to go back and undo the choices that had been made, the lines that had been crossed, the hearts that had been broken. I got up and asked everyone to give me a few minutes. I needed air, I needed space to think, and I went out to the backyard, that same backyard where Richard had built a swing for Thomas when he was little, where we had family barbecues every summer, where I had planted roses that now grew wild and uncontrolled because I no longer had the energy to care for them properly. I sat on the wooden bench under the old oak tree and closed my eyes, trying to organize my thoughts, trying to find some clarity in the midst of that chaos. And then I realized that the real question wasn't to judge Margaret or Thomas for the feelings they developed, because feelings are not choices. Feelings simply happen, but rather what they did with those feelings, the choices they made from them, and the impact those choices had on other people, especially Sarah and Emily. I realized that Margaret had been through unimaginable traumas and deserved compassion and support, but that this didn't exempt her from the responsibility of recognizing that getting emotionally involved with her nephew, even a nephew she hadn't known for most of her life, was still a transgression of important boundaries. And I realized that Thomas, my son, the boy I had raised to be honorable and respectful, had made decisions that were fundamentally selfish, placing his own emotional desires and needs above the commitment he had made to Sarah, above the stability he owed to Emily, and that now he needed to face the consequences of those choices, not in a punitive way, but in a way that allowed for real growth and accountability. I went back inside the house and everyone looked at me hoping I had some kind of answer, some maternal wisdom that would solve everything. But all I had was raw honesty and a refusal to simplify what was deeply complicated. I said that first, Margaret needed to go back to therapy, needed to work with a professional to understand her own motivations and patterns, to distinguish between genuine connection and seeking healing through inadequate means, and that until she did that work, any decision she made about her relationship with Thomas would be suspect and potentially destructive. I said that Thomas needed to do the same, needed to go to individual therapy and also couples therapy with Sarah if she was willing, needed to really examine why he was willing to risk his family for a connection that had all the characteristics of something built on problematic foundations, and that he needed to accept that even if his feelings for Margaret were real on some level, acting on them was a choice that had devastating consequences. And then I looked at Sarah and said that she didn't owe Thomas or anyone else the obligation to stay, to forgive, to try to rebuild, that she had every right to decide that this was unacceptable and irreconcilable, but that also if she chose to try to work on the marriage, that needed to be a genuine choice of hers and not something done out of pressure or fear of being a single mother or any other reason than her own desire to try. Sarah looked at me with red and swollen eyes from crying so much and said she didn't know what to do. That part of her wanted to grab Emily and run out of that house and never look back, but that another part of her still loved Thomas despite everything, still remembered the man he used to be before all this started, and that she didn't know if she was being strong by considering staying or weak by not having the courage to leave. I told Sarah that there was no right or wrong answer in this situation, that both choices were valid and would have their own challenges and consequences, and that the only thing I could offer was my unconditional support regardless of what she decided, that my house would always be open to her and Emily, that she didn't need to feel like a prisoner of an impossible situation because of family or social expectations. And then I looked at Margaret and Thomas sitting side by side on the sofa and said that they needed to separate completely for at least 6 months. No contact, no messages, no meetings, nothing. That they needed that space to gain perspective, to do the necessary therapeutic work, and to allow Thomas to focus on his family if there was still a family to focus on. Thomas started to protest, saying it was too long, that he needed Margaret in his life, but I interrupted him with a firmness I hadn't used with him since he was a teenager, saying that he didn't have the right to need Margaret in that way, that he had a wife and a daughter who needed him much more, and that if he couldn't make that temporary sacrifice, then that said everything about his priorities and about the depth of his commitment to his family. Margaret surprisingly agreed with me, saying I was right, that they needed that time apart, that she herself was beginning to question whether what they felt was really as special and true as it seemed, or if it was something inflated by the unique circumstances of the reunion, by the appeal of the forbidden, by the intensity of sharing deep secrets in a short period of time. She looked at Thomas and said that if what they had was real, then it would survive 6 months of separation, and if it didn't survive, then it was never strong enough to justify the destruction it was causing. I saw something break in Thomas's face when Margaret said this, as if he was finally understanding that the consequences of his actions were real and painful and couldn't simply be talked away or rationalized. Sarah watched all this with an expression I couldn't completely decipher, but which seemed to contain a mixture of satisfaction at seeing Thomas confronted with real boundaries and sadness at realizing how much their marriage had deteriorated without her noticing the signs until it was too late. We stayed sitting in that room for another 2 hours, talking in circles about the same points, crying, sometimes staying in long and uncomfortable silences, and eventually reaching a fragile agreement about the next steps. Margaret would return to Boston immediately and start intensive therapy the following week. Thomas would also start individual therapy and commit to having no contact with Margaret for the next 6 months. Sarah would take some time to decide whether she wanted to try couples therapy or preferred to go straight to separation proceedings, and I Well, I would try to process the fact that my sister had returned to my life after almost 3 decades only to reveal a horrible trauma from the past and a complicated problem in the present. When everyone finally got up to leave, Margaret approached me and hugged me for the first time in 27 years, and I felt all those decades of separation, all that lost time, all those conversations we never had, all those experiences we didn't share, and I cried embracing my sister like I hadn't cried since Richard died. Margaret whispered in my ear that she was sorry for bringing all this chaos into my life, that perhaps it would have been better if she had never come back, if she had just continued her separate life and left the past buried. But I told her no, that despite all the pain and confusion, I was happy to know she was alive, that she had survived, that she had built a life even after everything she had been through. I said we would find a way to navigate this, that family was complicated and messy and sometimes completely dysfunctional, but that it still meant something, was still worth fighting for. Sarah left the house without looking at Thomas, carrying Emily in her arms, and I saw my son watch them leave with an expression of total despair, finally understanding what he might be losing, finally feeling the real weight of his choices. Margaret was the last to leave, and before closing the door, she turned to me and said she would call me in a few days, that she wanted to rebuild our relationship as sisters regardless of what happened with the whole situation with Thomas, and I nodded because despite everything, I wanted that too. After everyone left, I sat back in my rocking chair and looked around the empty room, that room that just a few hours ago seemed so peaceful and predictable, and now was loaded with the weight of revelations and confessions that would forever change the dynamics of our family. I thought about how life has a way of throwing things at us when we least expect it, how you can wake up on a normal Sunday thinking it's going to be just another ordinary day and end the morning with your complete understanding of your family turned upside down. I thought about Dad and the legacy of trauma he left, and how if I had known then what I know now, I would have done everything differently. I would have questioned more, observed more carefully, created a safer space for Margaret to open up. But the past is immutable, and all we can do is try not to repeat the same mistakes, try to break the cycles of dysfunction and trauma instead of perpetuating them. In the weeks that followed that dramatic Sunday, a lot happened and changed. Sarah decided she wanted to try couples therapy with Thomas before making any definitive decision about the marriage, but she also rented a small apartment where she and Emily stayed during the process, giving space and time for both to process everything that had happened. Thomas dove into therapy in a way I had never seen him commit to anything before, attending sessions 3 times a week and really doing the difficult work of examining his own motivations, his vulnerabilities, the holes in his emotional life that he had tried to fill with the inappropriate connection with Margaret. Margaret was also doing her own therapeutic work in Boston, and although she and I talked regularly by phone, she kept her word and had no contact with Thomas. During our conversations, Margaret and I slowly began to rebuild our relationship as sisters, filling in the blanks of almost 3 decades of separate lives, sharing stories, lamenting the lost time, but also finding connection in the present. Margaret told me more details about the years after she ran away, about how terrifying it was to be completely alone at 19 in a big city without any support system, about the bad jobs and horrible apartments and moments of despair when she considered returning home despite everything. She told me about the therapy that eventually helped her process the trauma, about the support groups for abuse survivors that became her substitute family for many years, about the friendships she formed that helped her understand that she wasn't alone, that she wasn't to blame, that she deserved love and respect despite everything that had happened. And the more she shared, the more I understood not just what she had been through, but also how those experiences shaped the woman she became, and how her vulnerability and need for connection made her susceptible to the kind of inappropriate bond she developed with Thomas. I shared with her about my own life, about my marriage to Richard, which was mostly good, but also had its own complexities, about motherhood and the joys and challenges of raising Thomas, about widowhood and how strange it is to still be alive when the person you plan to grow old with is already gone. One day, about 3 months after that Sunday, Margaret called me and said she had realized something important during a particularly intense therapy session. She said her therapist helped her see that her connection with Thomas wasn't really about Thomas as an individual, but rather about what he represented. He was the bridge back to the family she lost, the opportunity to be an aunt, to have a family role again, and she had confused this deep need for belonging with romantic love. She said that the more time she spent separated from him, the clearer this realization became, and that although she still cared deeply about Thomas, she was beginning to understand that caring about someone and being in love with them are very different things. She said she was ashamed for letting things go so far, for participating in something that hurt Sarah so deeply, and that she wanted to find a way to apologize, to make amends, even knowing that Sarah might never forgive her. I told Margaret I was proud of her for doing this difficult work, for having the courage to question her own feelings and motivations, and that regardless of what happened, she was on the right path. Thomas was also making significant progress in his own therapy, and in one of our regular mother-son conversations, he confessed to me that he was beginning to see how selfish he had been, how much he had placed his own emotional needs above everything and everyone, and how much he had taken Sarah for granted. He said that growing up with a father like Richard, who always seemed to have all the answers and never showed vulnerability, made him also try to maintain that facade of having everything under control, of being the strong and stable man the family needed, and that in doing so, he never learned to really process or express his own insecurities and fears. When he met Margaret and she shared her own vulnerability and trauma so openly, it was as if something in him came loose, as if he finally had permission to also be vulnerable. And this created an intimacy he confused with romantic love, when in reality it was simply the first time he allowed himself to be emotionally honest with someone. He said he was working to bring that same emotional honesty to his relationship with Sarah, to be more open about his fears and insecurities instead of hiding them behind a mask of competence and control. Sarah, for her part, was doing her own work of examining the patterns in her relationship with Thomas and recognizing her own contribution to the problems that existed long before Margaret appeared. She told me in a particularly honest conversation that she had become so focused on being the perfect wife and perfect mother that she had completely lost sight of who she was as an individual, that she had sacrificed not only her career, but also her friendships, her hobbies, her own dreams and aspirations, everything on the altar of serving her family. She said she was beginning to understand that although what Thomas did was inexcusable, she had also created a dynamic in the marriage where he was the center of everything, and she was just a satellite orbiting around him, and that this wasn't healthy for either of them. She was working to recover her sense of independent identity, had started reconnecting with old friends, was considering returning to law at least part-time, and was establishing clearer boundaries about what she was and wasn't willing to accept in a relationship. When the 6 months of separation between Thomas and Margaret finally came to an end, we all met again, this time in the office of the couples therapist that Sarah and Thomas were seeing, because everyone agreed it was important to have a professional facilitator present for this conversation. The atmosphere was completely different from that chaotic Sunday morning 6 months ago. There was a calm and clarity that came from the fact that everyone had done significant internal work and was ready to have adult and responsible conversations about the future. Margaret spoke first, addressing mainly Sarah, and offered deep and sincere apologies for the role she played in causing so much pain, recognizing that regardless of her own reasons and traumas, she had made choices that hurt another person deeply, and that was unacceptable. She said that after 6 months of intensive therapy, she understood that what she thought she felt for Thomas was actually a complex mixture of need for family connection, seeking healing through inadequate means, and perhaps even a form of self-sabotage, because on some deep level she didn't believe she deserved healthy and appropriate connections. Thomas also apologized, not only to Sarah but also to Margaret, recognizing that he had also used the connection with her in ways that weren't fair, that he had projected onto her things she wasn't and couldn't be, and that he had placed both women in impossible positions because of his own inability to deal with his emotional needs in healthy ways. He said he understood now that what he really needed wasn't a forbidden romance, but rather to learn to be vulnerable and authentic within his existing marriage, to do the difficult work of building real emotional intimacy with Sarah, instead of seeking shortcuts through connections that were intense but fundamentally unstable. And then Sarah spoke, and her voice was firm and clear in a way I hadn't heard in a long time, and she said she had decided to give the marriage a real chance, not because she was forgiving and forgetting everything that had happened, but because through therapy, she and Thomas had made real progress in addressing the underlying problems that existed long before Margaret appeared. And she wanted to see if those advances could translate into a genuinely better and healthier relationship. But Sarah also made it very clear that she was establishing non-negotiable conditions, that Thomas would need to continue with individual therapy indefinitely, that they would continue with couples therapy for at least another year, that he would need to be completely transparent about where he was and with whom at all times, not in a controlling way, but simply because trust had been broken and would need to be rebuilt gradually through consistent actions. And as for Margaret, Sarah said that although she understood Margaret was family and had a right to be in Thomas's life in some capacity, she needed the boundaries to be very clear, that any relationship between Thomas and Margaret from now on would need to include Sarah, would need to be open and transparent, and would need to be the appropriate type of relationship between aunt and nephew, not the exclusive emotional intimacy they had developed. Margaret agreed with all these conditions without hesitation, saying she had also come to the conclusion that she needed clear boundaries, that she wanted to be in the family's life, but in a way that was healthy and appropriate for everyone involved. In the months that followed, slowly, very slowly, we began to find a new normal as a family. Sarah and Thomas moved back into the same house, but with a completely different dynamic, where both were more aware of their individual needs and more committed to communicating them clearly. Margaret became part of our occasional family gatherings, always with Sarah present, always maintaining appropriate boundaries, and gradually we all learned to navigate this unusual configuration in a way that was respectful to everyone. Emily, blessed by the natural resilience of children, adapted to the changes without seeming to carry much trauma, although I know that Sarah and Thomas remained vigilant about her emotional health and were ready to seek therapeutic support for her too if necessary. And I reconciled myself with the fact that families are complicated, that we all carry traumas and wounds that affect our choices and relationships, and that love, real love, isn't just the feeling, but rather the commitment to keep showing up, to do the difficult work, to establish healthy boundaries, and to choose authentic connection, instead of false intimacy based on secrets and transgressions. Looking back now, almost a year after that shocking Sunday, I can see that although the path was incredibly painful and difficult, it also forced us all to confront truths about ourselves and our family that we might never have faced otherwise. Margaret finally has a family again, even if it's a complicated and non-traditional configuration, and she's doing the ongoing healing work she deserves to have been doing for decades. Thomas learned crucial lessons about emotional responsibility, about the difference between feelings and actions, about the value of doing the difficult work within existing commitments instead of seeking escapes that only create more destruction. Sarah recovered her sense of identity and power, understanding that she doesn't need to diminish herself or sacrifice everything of herself to be a good wife and mother, that she can have strong boundaries and still choose love and commitment. And I learned that even at our age, even after thinking we know all the important truths about our family and our past, life can still surprise us, can still challenge us, can still offer us opportunities for growth and healing if we're willing to embrace complexity instead of running from it. So if you're reading or listening to this story and identifying with any part of it, if you're dealing with your own family trauma or secrets that are corroding your relationships or choices you've made that hurt people you love, I want you to know that you're not alone, that families are complicated everywhere, that we all carry wounds and make mistakes, but that there's also always possibility for healing, for growth, for making different choices from here on out. My family's story isn't unique. It's just a variation of universal themes of trauma, secrecy, transgression, and attempted redemption that repeat in families everywhere. And if there's one lesson I can share from everything we've been through, it's this. Secrets are toxic. Untreated trauma spreads through generations, and the only way to break these cycles is through radical honesty, committed therapeutic work, and willingness to establish and respect healthy boundaries even when it's difficult and uncomfortable. Now I want to hear from you. Leave in the comments below your reflections on this story. Have you gone through something similar in your own family? How did you deal with shocking revelations or betrayals that changed everything you thought you knew about the people you love? And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave your like, because it really helps to reach other people who may be going through similar situations and need to know they're not alone, that there are paths through the pain even when it seems impossible, and that families can survive and even grow through the most devastating crises if everyone is willing to do the necessary work.